The first thing Ambassador Dara Voss noticed when she stepped into the Grand Conclave of the Eternal Assembly was the smell. It hit her before anything else did, something between scorched metal and ancient rain, the kind of smell that had no name because no human language had ever needed one. She filed it away. She filed everything away. The second thing she noticed was that there was no chair for her. She had known intellectually from the briefing documents, from the diplomatic preparatory sessions, from the 17 hours of recorded council footage that her team had studied like scripture. She had known. But knowing a thing and standing inside it are two entirely different experiences, and Dara Voss stood very still in the entrance of the greatest governing chamber in the known galaxy and absorbed the full weight of what it meant to be unwelcome. Her name was Dara Voss. She was 44 years old. She had spent 9 years as a conflict resolution specialist, 6 years as an interplanetary legal attaché, and the last 2 years preparing for this single moment. She was the first human being to enter the Grand Conclave of the Eternal Assembly of Worlds, and she was doing it standing behind a polished barrier rail in a tiered alcove above the main floor that the Assembly called the Witness Enclosure. It was a gentle name for what it actually was: a pen, a viewing box, a place where species that had not yet earned the right to matter stood quietly and watched the species that had. The chamber itself was staggering. It rose in a perfect helix, level after level of curved seating carved from stone the color of deep ocean water, every surface catching the light and returning it fractured and blue. Below, arranged in a vast elliptical formation, were the seats of the 407 civilizations that comprised the Assembly's full membership. 407 species that had earned the right to sit, to speak, to vote on the laws that governed 2/3 of the explored galaxy. The chamber's light came from crystalline filaments threaded through the walls, and it shifted color in long, slow pulses, cycling through a spectrum that Dara's cultural attaché, a lanky historian named Bren Tao, had explained corresponded to the emotional state of the Velshari, the oldest species in the room, the architects of this place, the beings who had been building this institution for over 14,000 years. Dara stood at the rail and looked down at all of it and kept her face composed. That was what you did when you were the first representative of your entire species, and every set of eyes in the room, human and otherwise, was watching to see whether the pressure cracked you. There were 7 humans in the witness enclosure that day. Dara herself, Bren Tao, a legal analyst named Petra Solis, 27 years old and the most meticulous reader of fine print Dara had ever encountered, 2 embassy staff, and 2 security officers who had been told very clearly that their job was to stand still and look calm, regardless of what happened. Beside them in the enclosure stood 3 representatives of the Narathi, small beings covered in pale segmented shells who communicated in a clicking tonal language and had apparently been sitting in the witness enclosure for 47 years without any progress toward formal membership. They acknowledged the humans with a brief synchronized tilt of their upper appendages. Dara nodded back. The session had already begun by the time they arrived. A harmonic tone she couldn't hear had apparently signaled the start of formal proceedings, and the assembly was deep into its agenda. The first item was administrative. The second was a trade corridor reassessment. The third was a territorial water rights dispute between 2 species whose names Dara couldn't yet pronounce reliably.
The fourth item was supposed to be the acknowledgement of new observer registrations. It was not the fourth item. It was not the fifth, or the eighth, or the 12th. 2 hours passed. Dara watched. She watched which delegates leaned toward each other when a vote was called. She watched who interrupted whom and how the interrupted party responded. She watched the physical language of species she had only ever read about, the way the Velshari elder at the center of the main table moved its eyes independently of each other, scanning the room in slow, overlapping arcs. She was told this elder's name was Saveth. Saveth had been a council member for longer than the human species possessed written records. She had read the file. She knew what that meant. She was building a map, not of stars, of power. The acknowledgement came 2 hours and 40 minutes into the session, buried between a motion on navigation fees and a report on a disputed boundary 300 light-years from Earth. The session's announcer, a pale feathered avian species with a flat administrative voice, read from a data panel without looking up. Observer registration confirmed. Species designation, human. Home system, Sol. Status, provisional observation rights only. No voice, no vote, no standing. Enclosure position, 7. 14 words and a number.
That was humanity's introduction to the eternal assembly of worlds. Petra Solis wrote something in her notepad and said nothing. Bren Tau said nothing. Dara said nothing. And then, from below, Saveth spoke. The Velshari elder turned those two ancient, independent eyes upward toward the witness enclosure, and its voice came through Dara's translation earpiece like stone being ground slowly into powder. "The short flame species has arrived," it said, "wearing tools they did not forge, as anticipated." The laughter that moved through the chamber was not cruel in the human sense. It was almost academic, the laughter of 407 civilizations that had seen this pattern before and found it consistent with their expectations. A short flame was a fire that burned hot and fast and was gone before it could spread. The translation footnotes had explained the idiom on the briefing flight over. The laughter faded. The session continued. Nobody looked at the enclosure again. Dara turned to Bren, who was still writing in his notepad. She waited until he looked up. "Write down the exact words," she said quietly. "The time, the translation, who laughed and from which delegations." He looked at her. "All of it," she said. "We are going to need all of it." She turned back to the chamber. Below her, the assembly governed a galaxy that had not yet realized it had just made the last mistake it would ever make cheaply. Dara Voss was not angry. She was paying attention, and in her experience, that was considerably more dangerous. The human quarters aboard Assembly Station Conclave 7 were functional in the way that spaces are functional when they were designed by someone who did not expect their occupant to be there long. 1 viewport, 4 rooms, furniture scaled for species whose average height was a head shorter than a human adult. A commissary card that worked in approximately 60% of the station's food dispensaries, the other 40% carrying ingredients that were either incompatible with human biology or simply not recognized by the card because no one had thought to update the system. Bren Tau was already at the narrow table when Dara and Petra returned from the session, his hands folded in front of him in the way he folded them when he was working through something difficult. He had the kind of stillness about him that came not from calm, but from discipline.
a man who had spent 21 years studying the assembly from the outside and now sitting inside it and finding the experience precisely as disorienting as he had anticipated. "You watched the session feed?" Dara asked. "I did." "And Savith's comment?" "Savith," Bren said, "is 14,000 years old and has been wrong before." He paused, though rarely in front of 400 witnesses. Petra set her notepad on the table. "They didn't acknowledge us for over 2 hours. They acknowledged us. They simply didn't consider what they were acknowledging." Bren opened his tablet and turned it to face them. "I want to show you something. While you were in session, I accessed the Assembly's public database, standard archival material, member species profiles, observer registration records. I looked up the human file." Dara sat down. "Our complete file in the Assembly database is 11 pages long." The room was quiet. "The Velshari file is approximately 800,000 pages. The Arathi Collective is 220,000. The shortest file belonging to any full member species is the Sorveth, aquatic beings who have been spacefaring for only 900 years, and their record is still 6,000 pages. 11, Petra said. 11. The first 4 pages are detection reports from Velshari long-range probes that intercepted our early radio transmissions. The next 4 are developmental assessment reports filed at 20-year intervals. The last 3 are our observer application, the Assembly's response, and 1 administrative memo about enclosure placement." "What do the assessments say?" Dara asked. Bren read without inflection. Assessment 1, approximately 70 years prior. Species demonstrates early-stage technological emergence. Standard plateau trajectory anticipated within 2 to 3 generations. Assessment 2, 50 years prior. Species has achieved preliminary faster-than-light capability. Plateau now anticipated within 1 generation as internal pressures normalize development rate. Assessment 3, 30 years prior. Plateau has not occurred. Development continues at anomalous rate. File flagged for continued monitoring. The last line sat in the room for a moment. "External assistance," Petra said.
"They think someone gave us the technology," Dara said. "That, or they consider it the more probable explanation," Bren said. "Because the alternative, that a species 200 years into spaceflight could sustain that development rate without help, doesn't fit their models." This was the thing that Dara had been trying to find the precise words for since long before she ever set foot on this station. She had read the xenosociological literature. She understood the pattern. Every spacefaring civilization the Assembly had ever encountered followed the same arc. Emergence, rapid expansion, then equilibrium. The innovation curve flattened. The species reached a stable state of development, capable and comfortable, and they stayed there. It was consistent enough across enough species that the Assembly had built their entire classification system around it. They had timelines. They had models that predicted exactly where any given civilization would be in 100 years, in 1,000. Humanity had never reached equilibrium, not once, not for a single sustained generation. Every time something pushed back, humanity pushed back harder. Every time a wall appeared, they went over it, or under it, or directly through it, and then they kept moving. They did not stabilize. They did not plateau. They accelerated. And the Assembly's models had no category for that, because they had never seen it before. "They think it's luck," Bren said,
or assistance. Those are the two working theories among xenosociologists out here. He set down his tablet. No one has seriously proposed the third possibility. Which is, Petra asked, that this is simply what we are. Dara stood and walked to the viewport. The station's outer ring rotated slowly against the dark, and beyond it, stars she didn't know the names of drifted in long, patient arcs. She thought about the history she had grown up with, not the ceremonial version, the real one, full of catastrophe and recovery, of disasters that should have ended everything and somehow hadn't. The plagues that swept entire continents and left behind people who had learned to build medicine. The famines that starved civilizations into silence and left behind people who had learned to reshape soil and grow food where nothing grew before. The wars that tore apart every institution humans had ever constructed and left behind people who eventually, slowly, painfully, built better ones the next time. Every disaster had produced an adaptation. Every adaptation had made them stranger, more capable, harder to predict. They had not learned from success, they had learned from catastrophe. And by the time they looked up at the sky and decided to go there, they were carrying inside them 10,000 years of hard-won knowledge about surviving things that should have finished them. The assembly had never encountered a species like that, because nothing like that had ever walked through their door before. A formal document arrived that evening. Classification Division, Assembly Administration, routine processing notification for all new observer registrations. Humanity had been designated Class 4, Nascent Emergence. Class 4 was the category for civilizations that had not yet established permanent presence beyond their home system. Humanity had 23 colony worlds. They had been operating beyond the Sol system for 64 years. Dara read the document twice. She set it down very carefully, making sure not to crease it. "We're going to file a formal objection," Dara said. "Of course," Petra said, already writing. "Documented, methodical, submitted through every correct procedural channel with every piece of supporting evidence we can attach." "And when they ignore it?" Bren asked, not pessimistically, just practically. "Then we'll have a record that they ignored it," Dara said. "Everything they dismiss, every correction they refuse, every door they close, all of it, documented, because I am building an argument for not today. I am building an argument for the day they can no longer afford to dismiss it." She looked at the document sitting flat on the table. "We are going to fill every blank space they have left for us," she said. "And when we're done, they won't be able to pretend the blanks were ever empty." Outside, the stars continued their slow, indifferent drift. And somewhere in the Assembly's database, humanity's 11-page file was about to start growing. 3 years on Assembly Station Conclave 7 had changed Dara Voss in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully articulate. Her team had grown from 5 people to 13. They had developed genuine working relationships with 9 other species in the witness enclosure, including the Narathi, who turned out to maintain an intricate web of informal connections throughout the assembly, despite having no formal standing, and a species called the Devori, tall amphibious beings with extraordinary long-term memory, who had been sitting in the witness enclosure for 38 years and had not forgotten a single procedural slight in all that time. The assembly itself had not changed at all. That was the nature of ancient institutions. They moved like deep water, slowly with enormous weight, eroding everything they passed over into smooth and consistent uniformity. The Velshari had been building this system for 14,000 years. They saw no reason to question it now. Then the Kavari and the Suro began their war. Dara was in a working meeting with Petra and 2 Narathi contacts when the alert came through. A territorial conflict had erupted in the Sarath cluster, a dense star system region approximately 280 light-years from human space, rich in rare mineral deposits that both the Kavari Dominion and the Suro Collective claimed as sovereign territory. The Kavari were expansionist and hierarchical, a species that had built their entire civilization on the philosophy of legitimate conquest. The Suro were patient and calculating, 2,000 years of strategic infiltration and careful withdrawal compressed into a culture that treated every interaction as a long game. When those 2 philosophies met over the same star cluster, conflict was inevitable. What was not predictable was how fast it spread. Within 5 weeks, both sides were maneuvering full fleets, establishing blockades, conducting probing engagements that each publicly denied were actual hostilities. The Assembly convened emergency sessions, committees formed, subcommittees formed to advise the committees. Speeches were delivered and entered into the formal record while the fleets kept moving. The document arrived on a Wednesday morning. Petra brought it in with the specific, careful way she held things when she was containing strong emotion. The Assembly's Conflict Mediation Division had designated the Sarath Transit Corridor as a neutral buffer zone for the duration of hostilities. The Sarath Transit Corridor was a navigational lane running through a section of space that had, for bureaucratic reasons, never been formally assigned to any single species. It was also the only efficient route between humanity's 4 outermost colony worlds and the rest of human space. Cutting the corridor would strand approximately 380,000 human colonists. The formal request was polite in the way that only very old institutions know how to be polite, dressed in the language of regret and cooperation while delivering something that was entirely indifferent to the people it affected. Humanity was asked to withdraw all presence from the corridor and the 4 colony worlds within its operational range within 60 days. The request was signed personally by Saveth. Dara read it 3 times. Observer status settlements, that was the phrase they used. Not homes, not communities, not the places where people were born and buried and built lives across 2 generations. Observer status settlements, inconveniences rather than realities. When is the formal session on this matter? Dara asked. 3 days. Then I will be on the floor in 3 days. She had never spoken from the assembly floor. Observer species were technically permitted to address the full chamber on matters directly affecting their populations under a provision of the founding charter that had not been invoked in over 170 years. The administrative office spent 2 days locating the relevant procedural documentation. The chamber was at full capacity when she walked onto the main floor, every seat occupied. The crystalline light was cycling through deep gold, which someone had told her signaled heightened anticipation in Velshari culture, either a tribute or a warning, possibly both. Saveth was at the center of the main table, those 2 ancient eyes finding her immediately with the practiced sweep of a being that had seen this chamber through 14,000 years of change. She had prepared 3 versions of her address, diplomatic, measured, and direct. She had intended to begin with diplomatic. Then Saveth spoke. "The short flame species returns," the elder said through the translation feed. "With 60 days remaining to comply, I confess uncertainty about what remains to discuss." The laughter this time was smaller, not all delegations, but present. Dara placed her prepared remarks face down on the speaker's stand and did not look at them again. "Honored Saveth," she said, her voice carrying cleanly through the chamber's acoustics, "the Eternal Assembly has formally requested that humanity abandon 4 settled colony worlds and the corridor connecting them to our home space, the homes of nearly 400,000 people, to serve as a buffer zone in a conflict between 2 Assembly members." She paused just long enough for the translation to cycle. "I am here to inform the Assembly, respectfully and formally, that we will not be doing that." The chamber was very still. "The Assembly is further advised to consult its long-range scanning systems before the end of this session regarding the current disposition of assets in the Sarath corridor."
Savith's eyes moved in a way Dara had learned to read as curiosity. What assets does a Class 4 species possess that bear upon this matter? I suggest the scanners, Dara said, will answer that more efficiently than I can. She gathered her materials and returned to the enclosure. She had made one transmission to Earth's Strategic Coordination Office 14 hours earlier, a 7-minute conversation. She had not given orders. She had described a situation and asked for options assessment. The response had arrived within the hour. At the exact moment she was speaking, the long-range scanning network serving Conclave 7 was detecting something in the Sarath corridor that had not been there 72 hours prior. 22 ships, human vessels. None registered with the Assembly Defense Registry because observer species were not required to register. None catalogued in the Assembly database because no one had ever thought to ask what human shipyards were producing. They were dark and precisely proportioned and arranged in a formation that placed them between the corridor entrance and the 4 colony worlds like a wall made of patience. They were broadcasting on open frequencies in calm, clear voices, noting that the corridor was currently occupied and that civilian traffic was advised to seek alternate routes pending resolution of the situation. The Kavhari fleet, advancing from the northwest, stopped. The Suro fleet, moving from the southeast, stopped. Neither had encountered human military hardware. Neither knew what it could do. And in the mathematics of conflict, an unknown factor of 22 perfectly positioned vessels holding absolutely still was not a variable anyone wanted to test. Dara was in her office when Petra's communications panel lit up with a priority transmission from the assembly chamber. "They want to speak with you," Petra said. "Tell them I'm available tomorrow morning at 800 hours." Petra looked at her. "Not tonight," Dara said. "Let them look at those ships on their scanners tonight. Let them sit with everything they don't know about us." Outside the viewport, the stars drifted slowly, and somewhere out in the dark, 22 ships held perfectly still between what was humanity's and everything else, making no threats, requiring no justification, simply being present with the quiet, absolute certainty of a species that had learned, across 10,000 years of catastrophe and recovery, that the most powerful statement is not a raised voice. It is an unmistakable presence. The meeting the following morning was not in the main chamber. It was in a small briefing room on the station's 7th level. Lower ceiling, steady white light, a round table that held 12 chairs without the grandeur of the main hall to amplify anyone's sense of authority. The assembly sent 5 representatives, including Saveth at the center. The Velshari elder looked different in a small room, still ancient, still composed, but without the architecture of the Grand Conclave to magnify it. Saveth was simply an old being in a chair, and Dara was simply a person across a table, and they were going to talk. "You have created significant disruption," Saveth said.
The conflict between the Kavhari and Suro created disruption, Dara replied. We responded to it by positioning our own vessels in a designated buffer zone without assembly authorization, by positioning our own vessels in an unclaimed navigational corridor adjacent to our own populated worlds while a conflict between assembly members advances toward those worlds. The corridor has never been formally assigned to any governing body. If it belongs to no one, then it belongs as much to us as to anyone, Dara said. One of the other representatives, a being named Counselor Veth from the Irath delegation, leaned forward. The vessels you deployed carry weapons systems not recorded in the Assembly Defense Registry. Observer species are not required to register weapon systems. They are also not authorized to operate unregistered military assets in contested space. The corridor is unclaimed space, and we are not operating military assets. We are operating vessels with defensive capabilities in proximity to our populated worlds, while a conflict between Assembly members advances toward those worlds. Counselor Veth sat back. Bren Tao, beside Dara, had his hands folded on the table and was studying the middle distance with the expression of a man working very hard not to smile. Savith was quiet for a moment. Then those two ancient eyes moved, both of them simultaneously, focusing together on Dara in a way she had not seen the elder do before. "What are you?" Savith asked. It was not a procedural question, not a diplomatic formality. It was a genuine question from a being that had watched civilizations rise and dissolve for 14,000 years and just encountered something that did not fit any of its categories. Dara let the silence sit for a breath, because the question deserved a real answer, not a prepared one. "I'll try to explain," she said.
She talked about Earth, about a planet that had never been gentle, never been comfortable, never provided the stable conditions under which most spacefaring civilizations had developed their intelligence. She talked about what it meant to evolve under continuous pressure, prey as well as predator, perpetually threatened, perpetually adapting. She talked about the catastrophes that should have ended everything and hadn't, and what humanity had built in the spaces those catastrophes left behind. "Your xenobiologists have a category," Bren said quietly, speaking for the first time, called apex stable species, civilizations that evolved unchallenged at the top of their food chains and developed intelligence in conditions of relative security. The pattern is consistent. They tend toward rapid expansion followed by stable equilibrium. They reach a comfortable plateau because they never needed to develop the kind of deep adaptive capacity that comes from prolonged existential challenge. Humans, Dara said, evolved under pressure, constant, layered, unrelenting pressure. And every time that pressure nearly broke us, we came back knowing something we hadn't known before. We kept those lessons. Every generation inherited them. We are built from them." She leaned forward slightly. "When the Assembly looks at human history, you see chaos. I understand that. 10,000 years of recorded civilization, much of it marked by conflict and catastrophe. To a species that achieved stability 12,000 years ago, that looks unreliable, dangerous possibly." "It does," Savith said. "What you are not seeing," Dara said, "is what we built every single time we came back from one of those catastrophes. What you are not measuring is the speed of the recovery. What your models do not account for is that every failure in human history produced a lesson, and we kept every single one. We carry them in our institutions, our culture, our bodies. We are made of them." She paused.
You called us short flames, a fire that burns fast and disappears. I understand why that seemed accurate. We are young by your standards, extraordinarily young. But a short flame doesn't remember anything. It doesn't pass anything forward. It simply burns and goes out. She held Savath's gaze across the table. Humanity is not going out. The room was very quiet. We have been mapping this region of the galaxy for 37 years, Dara continued, not because we were directed, not as part of any official program, because we had people who were curious and tools to satisfy that curiosity and a deep, unshakable instinct to fill blank spaces. We mapped every assembly member's home system, every transit route, every resource distribution network. We did this as a matter of habit. She let that land. That is not a threat. It is a description of what we are. We are explorers. We are builders. We are a species that looks at empty space and sees potential. And we are a species that has been told since we arrived here that we do not belong at the table. She looked around the room slowly. We belong at the table. And I think, given what the last 18 hours have demonstrated, the Assembly is beginning to understand why. The meeting ran 4 hours. No decisions were made, no commitments recorded, but something moved in that room quietly, without announcement, the way deep water shifts when something new enters it, redistributing weight it had never had to account for before. When they walked out into the corridor afterwards, Bren was quiet for several steps. "Savath's eyes," he said finally. They focused together, both of them. I've never read a documented instance of a Velshari elder doing that in a formal meeting. "What does it mean?" Petra asked. In Velshari nonverbal communication, bilateral eye convergence indicates something between profound reassessment and alarm. "Good," Dara said. "It is not necessarily a comfortable reaction to generate." "No," Dara said, "but it's an honest one. And right now, I would rather have their honest reaction than their comfortable dismissal." The Sarath corridor ceasefire came 6 weeks later. The Kavari and Suro agreed to assembly-mediated terms. The buffer zone designation was withdrawn. The colony worlds were never touched. The 22 ships returned to their regular patrol routes without announcement, which Dara felt was the appropriate way to end that particular statement. But in the small briefing room on Level 7, something had been said that a ceasefire between 2 other species could not unsay. The galaxy had shifted, quietly, fundamentally, and there was no shifting it back.
Word travels fast in a place where 407 civilizations share one station. Within 4 days of the meeting with Savath, Dara had received 14 private communications from Assembly representatives. Not from the senior powers, the Velshari, the Arathi, the ancient delegations that had held the center of the main table since before humanity had written language, but from the others, the mid-tier members, the ones who had held full seats for less than 2,000 years and still carried in their institutional memory what it had felt like to be newer than the beings around them. And then, more quietly, the communications from the witness enclosure began. The Narathi sent their representative, a being named Sick, who arrived at Dara's door one evening, carrying a flat data tablet and the careful expression of someone who had learned through long experience not to hope too loudly. "You said things in that room that have been said privately for a long time," Sick told her. "The difference is that when you said them, the other side listened." "They listened because of the ships," Dara said. "They listened because of the ships," Sick agreed, "but they heard because of the words." The Narathi set the tablet on the table. It contained 58 names, all observer species,
all sitting in enclosure positions, watching a table they had never been invited to join, some for decades. The Devori historian Vel had been in that enclosure for 38 years. 38 years of accumulated patience and documented injustice, and the particular quiet dignity of someone who had long since stopped expecting the system to correct itself, but had never stopped working to correct it. "These species want to know if you have a plan," Six said. Dara looked at the list for a long moment. 58 civilizations, 58 peoples who had traveled to this station to participate in the governance of a galaxy and been handed enclosure position numbers instead. "I have the beginning of one," she said. "Give me 3 weeks." What Dara built over those 3 weeks she later called the Reform Coalition, and she was precise about what it was and what it wasn't. It was not a rebellion. It was not a destabilizing movement, regardless of how the Assembly's old guard would characterize it. It was a legal, procedural, formally documented proposal to amend the Assembly's membership and governance charter. Every draft shared openly, every argument built on Assembly precedent, every move made through correct channels. The coalition's legal architecture was built by a human trade specialist named Idris Kane, who turned out to possess one of the most precise legal minds Dara had encountered in a career spent working with precise legal minds. Idris could locate the exact sentence in 14,000 years of Assembly jurisprudence that made their position not just defensible, but airtight, and then write the argument for it in language so clean and unambiguous that challenging it meant arguing against your own founding documents. Bren contributed the historical analysis, meticulous, comprehensive, sourced from the Assembly's own archives. Vel, the Devori historian, contributed something more valuable still. 38 years of documented institutional memory, every procedural inconsistency and classification error and quietly overlooked violation that the Assembly had committed and recorded, and then apparently assumed no one was keeping track.
The final document was 304 pages long. Historical evidence, statistical analysis, legal precedent, and a single clear request at the end. Full voting membership for all spacefaring species, regardless of years of operation. A revised classification system based on demonstrated capability rather than arbitrary developmental thresholds, and the dissolution of the witness enclosure as a governance structure. The Assembly received it on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday, Savith had convened an emergency senior session to discuss it. By Saturday, the political resistance had begun in earnest. The old guard employed every tool available: procedural delays, requests for extended review periods, referrals to subcommittees that lacked the authority to act, classification challenges requiring additional documentation cycles. Savith was particularly formidable. 14,000 years of institutional experience does not make a being wrong about everything, but it makes them exceptionally good at defending a position they have held long enough to believe is simply correct. There were days when Dara thought they might not get there. One of those days, Idris found her late in her office and sat across from her without speaking for a moment. "Do you know the average duration of a major Assembly governance reform effort?" he asked. "Tell me." "To first proposal to ratification, 320 years. Dara was quiet. "We don't have 320 years, Idris said, "but we have something the previous reformers didn't." He paused.
The ships in the Seraph corridor, they're still on the assembly scanners. She looked at him. Not our ships now, he said. Not anymore. Over the past 10 days, 11 additional vessels have taken up positions alongside the original 22. None of them human. None of us coordinated with them directly. The Narathi sent 1. The Devori sent 2. 8 other enclosure species sent 1 each. He folded his hands on the table. They're there because of the corridor, she said. No, the corridor situation is resolved. They're there because this is how you signal solidarity without saying anything that can be entered into a formal record and used against you. A slight pause. It's the language of presence, apparently a very old form of communication in this part of the galaxy. He let that sit. The Velshari invented it. Dara laughed, quietly, almost involuntarily, because sometimes the universe had that kind of precision. The political battle ran for another 4 months. Dara did not sleep enough. Her team did not sleep enough. The delays were relentless, and the subcommittee reports came back negative, and the senior powers closed ranks in ways that felt like trying to push against a mountain that had been standing for so long it had forgotten mountains could be moved. But the coalition held, and it grew. 3 full assembly members, mid-tier delegates who had quietly nursed dissatisfaction with the classification system for centuries, moved from sympathetic observers to active participants. Then 4 more, then 5. Each addition was documented, each commitment recorded, each vote was a name attached to a position that could not easily be retracted once it was in the formal record. Petra tracked the numbers daily. One morning she came to Dara with her notepad and set it on the desk without a word, and Dara looked at the count. They were close. Close enough that the outcome was no longer a question of if, but of when. The vote came on a morning when the station's light panels were set to warm amber. Someone told Dara it was a Velshari Council tradition for sessions of particular significance, a color associated with major decisions, used sparingly across 14,000 years of governance. The last time it had been invoked was for a territorial resolution that had ended a 3-century border conflict. Before that, the formal admission of the Arathi delegation, 700 years ago. This morning it was amber, and the Grand Conclave was at full capacity. Dara sat in the witness enclosure for the last time, not because protocol required it. She had a legitimate right to the floor now as lead petitioner. She sat there because it felt right to begin where she had started, because the people standing around her in that enclosure had been standing there for decades, some of them, and they deserved to have someone beside them for this moment. Sick, the Narathi stood to her left, clicking softly in a pattern Dara recognized as anticipation. Vel, the Devori, stood to her right, 38 years of waiting compressed into a stillness that was almost unbearable to witness. Petra was counting under her breath, running the numbers one final time, though the numbers would not change now. The proposal was read into the record by the session announcer. All 304 pages, condensed to its essential motion in 41 words that Idris had written with the care of someone who understood that words placed in a permanent record are words that outlast the people who wrote them. The vote was called. The Velshari bloc voted against, as anticipated. 4 votes, united, ancient, certain that the system they had built deserved to endure in the form they had built it. The Arathi split, 2 against, 2 in favor, 1 abstention. That had not been anticipated. The abstention sent a ripple through the chamber that took a full minute to settle. The Suro voted in favor, 4 votes, calculating, as always, having privately determined that a restructured assembly with broader membership served their long-term strategic interests better than a closed one. The votes came in from across the elliptical table, both sides, the chamber tracking each entry with the crystalline light shifting in slow pulses, amber deepening toward gold. Petra's counting under her breath became barely audible. Dara kept her face composed and her hands still on the rail. Then the coalition members voted, 12 full assembly civilizations that had, over 4 months, moved from cautious observers of the Reform Coalition to committed participants in it. They voted in favor, one after another. Each vote entered into the permanent record. Each vote the product of months of documentation and argument, and the slow, stubborn insistence that accuracy matters more than institutional convenience. The final tally was announced. The motion had passed by 6 votes. The chamber was very quiet. Not the stunned quiet of surprise, but the deep quiet of something enormously heavy, finally completing the motion it had been building toward for a long time. The session announcer read the formal declaration. The Assembly's membership structure would be amended. The classification system would be revised. The witness enclosure would be formally dissolved within the next Assembly cycle, and all current observer species would be reclassified under the new framework. Dara did not cheer. Nobody on the coalition side made noise. It did not feel like a moment for noise. It felt like the moment just before and just after a deep breath, when everything that had been held in suspension finally settles into a new position. They filed out of the enclosure in silence. In the corridor outside the chamber, Sik found her and touched her arm once, the Narathi gesture equivalent to a handshake, and said very quietly, 47 years. Nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed saying.
The following morning, Dara was summoned to the Grand Conclave chamber. Not to the enclosure, not to the small briefing room on level 7, to the main floor, to a chair at the main table. She walked across the floor of the Grand Conclave chamber in full session for the first time, her footsteps very quiet against the dark blue stone, 14,000 years of history beneath her feet. The chair was functional and plain, no ceremony about it, just a chair at a table, which is what a chair at a table always is, and never only is. She sat down. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table surface. It was smooth and faintly warm, the stone holding some quality of all the light that had passed over it for 14,000 years. She thought about every person who had not lived to see this, the ones who had aimed early telescopes at empty sky and dared to believe something was out there. The ones who had run the first calculations and built the first ships and gone into the dark without knowing what they would find. The ones who had been told in one form or another, in one language or another, that they were too young, too chaotic, too unpredictable to belong among the stars, that they should wait until the universe decided they were ready. And she thought about what humanity had done instead. They had not waited to be invited. They had not waited to be declared ready. They had shown up and paid attention and built something out of nothing,
out of 11 pages in a database and an enclosure position number, and a dismissal dressed as courtesy. And at the end of it, they were sitting at the table. Not because the galaxy had determined they deserved it, because they had determined they deserved it, and then they had done the work to make that determination impossible to deny. Sabbath entered the chamber. The Velshari elder moved to the center seat with the slow, deliberate grace of an ancient body that had performed this motion 10,000 times, settled, swept the room with that practiced dual gaze. When the sweep reached Dara, it stopped. For a long moment, across the full length of the table, those two ancient eyes held on her. She looked back, not defiantly, not with triumph, just clearly, the way you look at someone when something real has passed between you, even if that something is a long argument finally concluded. Then Sabbath rose, slowly, with enormous deliberate intention, the full height of the Velshari elder standing in the amber light of the Grand Conclave, and then the great gray head inclined forward, not the small forward tilt of acknowledgement, not the deep bow of deference, but the level bow, held for 3 seconds from a standing position to another standing position, equal to equal. Dara had read the cultural notes on Velshari gesture language 40 times in the years she had been on this station. She knew exactly what it meant. I see you now as I did not see you before. It was not an apology precisely, but it was the closest thing the Velshari had. Dara rose from her chair, inclined her head at the same angle, the same 3 seconds. They sat back down. The session was called to order. 413 civilizations at the main table, with 11 more to be formally seated in the coming weeks. The work of the assembly continued as it always had, slowly, with great weight, but now with different weight. Weight distributed across more hands, more perspectives, more kinds of experience than had ever sat in that room before. Bren Tao found a seat in the gallery above, the regular public gallery, not the enclosure, which had already been formally marked for dissolution, and Dara could see him from where she sat, hands folded, watching with the expression of a man who had spent 21 years studying this institution from the outside, and now watching history happen in real time and finding it precisely as significant as he had always hoped it would be. Petra was at the communications desk in the human delegation suite, already drafting the report to Earth. There would be a great deal to write. Idris was probably already reviewing the procedural documentation for the formal seating of the new members, looking for any clause that could be tightened, any ambiguity that could be clarified, any blank space that needed to be filled in. That was what they did, after all. Dara opened her notepad, the same one she had been keeping since the very first day in the enclosure, since Sabbath had called them short flames and the chamber had rippled with laughter. She turned to the first page. The first entry was simple, a date, a time, the exact words Sabbath had said, a note in her own handwriting. Write it all down. She turned to a clean page at the back. She wrote the date. She wrote full membership confirmed, vote passed. She wrote the number of votes. Then she wrote one more line, not for the record, for herself. A mayfly lives one day, but it does not spend that day standing still. She closed the notepad. Around her, the greatest governing body in the known galaxy called itself to order, And for the first time in 14,000 years, humanity was not watching from above. They were in it. They were part of it. They had always been going to be part of it. It had just taken the galaxy a little while to understand that.